Some problems are much more serious. Boeing 737 MAX aircraft. Boeing 737 MAX aircraft were grounded in 2019. After two uh, after two fatal crashes caused partly by a software flaw. Boeing 707 MAX aircraft were grounded in 2019 after two fatal crashes caused partly by a software flaw. Investigators have since found lesser bugs. Airlines are, for instance, now advised to turn the plane off and on again to turn the plane off and on again. Every 51 days to stop its computers. Displaying false data in mid-flight. Airlines are, for instance, now advised to turn their airplanes on and off and on again every 51 days to stop its computers displaying false data in mid-flight. A similar problem found in 2017 in some airplanes made by Airbus, Boeing's European rival, prompted the European Union Aviation Safety Agency to require that such aircraft be rebooted at least every 149 hours. To require that such aircraft be rebooted every 149 hours. A similar problem found in some airplanes made by Airbus, Boeing's European rival, prompted the European Union Aviation Safety Agency to prompted such aircraft be rebooted at least every 149 hours. Blame for companies' IT woes often ends up in the boardroom. Blame for companies' IT woes often ends up in the boardroom. Sometimes that is fair. Dennis Muilenburg was rightly forced to resign as Boeing's CEO. Dennis Muilenburg was rightly forced to resign as Boeing CEO after the tragic 737 MAX disasters. Dennis Muilenburg was rightly forced to resign as Boeing CEO after the tragic 737 MAX disasters. But not always. For software is hard. And hard to keep up with. For software is hard and hard to keep up with. And the employees expected to produce it are often the products. And the employees often. And the employees expected to produce it are often the products of a different. And employees expected to produce it are often the products. That is in many ways oddly pre-modern. of a discipline that is in many ways oddly pre-modern. The employees expected to produce this are often the products of a discipline, that is in many ways oddly pre-modern.
When software is eating the world,
When software is eating the world,
Silicon Valley speak for a situation where most firms are
Silicon Valley speak for a situation where most firms are,
greater or lesser extent, software companies.
to a greater or lesser extent, are software companies.
That matters.
That matters. When software is eating the world, Silicon Valley speak for a situation where most firms are,
Eating the world, Silicon Valley speak for a situation where most firms are
to a greater or lesser extent, greater or lesser extent, to a greater or lesser extent, software firms, software companies. That matters.
or lesser extent, software companies. That matters. Start with the computer code itself.
Start with the computer code itself.
Programming requires a mix of hyper-literalness and creativity.
Software
Programming requires a mix of hyper-literalness and creativity.
Programming requires a mix of hyperliteralness and creativity.
Tiny errors like a misplaced punctuation mark
Tiny errors like a misplaced punctuation mark
can completely change how a system behaves.
An
industry rule of thumb is that
an industry rule of thumb is that
depending on how carefully they work,
programmers make between 0.5 and 50 errors.
Programmers make between 0.5 and 50 errors in every 1,000 lines of code they write.
In every 1,000 lines of code they write.
50 errors in every 1,000 lines of code they write. Because cars and aircraft contain tens of millions of lines.
Because cars and aircraft contain tens of millions of lines.
The chances of an error-free system are in effect zero.
The chances of an error-free system are in effect zero.
The chances of an error-free system are in effect zero. Even when bugs do not lead to catastrophe. They put a constant drag on a firm's productivity. They put constant drag on a firm's productivity.
They put constant drag on a firm's creativity.
A survey commissioned by Stripe. A digital payments processor.
Suggested that the average developer spends 21 hours a week
fixing old or bad code.
The inherent difficulty of programming is made worse
by the shortcomings of software engineering as a profession.
By the shortcomings of software engineering as a profession.
Programming is made worse by the shortcomings of software engineering as a profession. These are laid out in a book, The Problem with Software.
Why smart engineers write bad code.
The author, Adam Barr, spent 20 years as a developer.
The author, Adam Barr, spent 20 years as a developer.
For Microsoft, the software giant.
And Barr spent 20 years as a developer for Microsoft, the software giant.
Many coders, he notes, are at least partly self-taught.
Many coders, he notes, are at least partly self-taught.
Many coders, he notes, are at least partly self-taught.
Many coders, he notes, are at least partly self-taught.
That leads to bad habits which software engineering courses fail to support. That leads many coders, he notes, are at least partly self-taught. That leads to bad habits which software engineering courses fail to correct. There is too little communication between academia and industry.
There is too little communication between academia and industry,
and no real agreement on what to teach
and no real agreement on what to teach
or what habits to instill.
The result, argues Mr. Barr, is a field in
The results, argue Mr. Barr, are
which habits to instill. The result, argues Mr. Barr, is a field
the result, argues Mr. Barr, is a field
in which folklore and fads too often take the place of professional standards.
in which fads and folklore often take the place of professional standards. In which fads and folklore too often take the place of professional standards.
To illustrate the field's shaky foundations,
Mr.
Barr points to the practice popular with technology firms
Mr. Barr points to the practice popular with
like Google Key Foundations. Mr. Barr points to the practice popular with technology firms
Mr. Barr points to the practice popular with technology firms
like Google or Apple
of giving job candidates a programming problem to solve on a whiteboard. Few other fields behave that way because they assume by dint of having graduated.
Few other fields behave that way because they assume that by dint of having graduated, applicants have already achieved a basic level of competence.
Applicants achieved a basic level.
Having graduated, applicants have already achieved a basic level of competence.
Applicants have already achieved a basic level of competence.
Doctors do not expect anatomy quizzes before being hired.
Doctors do not expect anatomy quizzes before being hired.
Mechanical engineers are not required to jot down Newton's laws of motion to prove their bona fides. Engineers are not required to do quizzes before being hired. Mechanical engineers are not required to jot down Newton's laws of motion to
Mechanical engineers are not required to
prove their mechanical engineers are not required to jot down Newton's laws of motion to
Mechanical engineers are not required to jot down Newton's laws of motions.
Mechanical engineers are not required to jot down Newton's laws of motion to prove their bona fides. All those problems are compounded by software engineering's breathless rate of change. Problems are laws of motion to prove their bona fides. All those problems are compounded
by
software engineering's breathless rate of change. Even when a system works,
it rapidly becomes obsolete.
The woes of British banks are largely the result of trying to make them obsolete. The woes of British banks are largely the result of trying to maintain such legacy systems. Written by long departed programmers, often outsourced in half-forgotten computer languages. Programmers, often outsourced in half-forgotten computer languages to satisfy criteria no one can quite remember. Coders under pressure to add nifty new features often cut corners,
are often cut corners,
storing up problems for the ever less distant future. ever less distant future.
Corners, storing up problems for the ever less distant future.
Storing up problems for the ever less distant future.
The result, says one expert with decades of experience,
Result, says one expert with decades of experience,
is that shiny new IT systems can rapidly devolve. Of experience is that shiny new IT systems can rapidly devolve into rickety, half-understood contraptions.
Can rapidly devolve into
Can rapidly devolve into rickety, half-understood contraptions.
Can rapidly devolve into rickety, half-understood contraptions.
Held together with gaffer tape and a prayer.
Held together with gaffer tape and a prayer.
Stood contraptions held together with gaffer tape and a prayer. Eventually, the costs become too great to ignore.
Eventually, the costs become too great to ignore.
And companies must upgrade their systems.
And companies must upgrade their systems.
Become too great to ignore. And companies must upgrade their systems. But that is the moment of maximum danger.
But that is the moment of maximum danger.
For the new software must do everything. But that is the moment of maximum danger. For the new software must do everything that the half-understood old one in danger. For the new software must do everything.
For the new software must do everything
that the half-understood old one does.
That the half-understood old one does.
And more.
And more.
It is to repeat a common but apposite analogy.
It is to repeat a common and apposite analogy.
More. It is to repeat a common but apposite analogy.
It is to repeat a common but apposite analogy.
Like rebuilding an aircraft in flight.
Like rebuilding an aircraft in flight.
VW is doing its best to iron out the kinks with
VW is doing its best to iron out the kinks
the ID3's snazzy features.
With the
is doing its best to iron out the kinks with the ID3's snazzy features.
With the ID3's snazzy features.
The firm wants to bring most software development.
The firm wants to bring most software development.
Snazzy features. The firm wants to bring most software development back in-house.
Back in-house.
And has spent €7 billion. That's 8% software development back in-house. And has spent €7 billion. That's 8% software development back in-house. And has spent €7 billion. Wants to bring most software development back in-house. And has spent €7 billion.
And has spent €7 billion.
$8 billion.
That's $8 billion.
On a shiny new digital unit.
On a shiny new digital unit.
That is probably a good idea.
That is probably a good idea.
However, as Mr.
Barr argues,
the structural problems with writing software mean that spending money on it is the structural problems with writing software mean that spending money on it does not by itself guarantee with writing software mean that spending money on it does not by itself guarantee success.
Does not by itself guarantee success.
One great advantage possessed by startups like Tesla or Monzo,
like Tesla or Monzo,
a newish online bank in Britain, is that their programmers are handed a blank sheet of paper. With no legacy systems to maintain. And fewer old bugs to root out. Their software is more robust. And developers can spend more time on features that customers want. If that is called comfort for older companies that have no easy way of starting afresh. Computing greybeards offer reassurance.
After a fashion.
The startups' advantages will, they predict,
prove
temporary.
Prove temporary.
Bugs will creep in.
Bugs will creep in.
Bod jobs will go unfixed.
Bot jobs will go unfixed.
Developers will leave,
Developers will leave,
taking knowledge with them.
taking knowledge with them.
Today's feisty usurpers will become tomorrow's clumsy incumbents.
Today's feisty usurpers will become tomorrow's clumsy incumbents,
held back by their
antiquated,
unreliable IT,
unreliable IT,
and ripe for disruption in turn.
and ripe for disruption in turn.